Over NBC's coast-to-coast network of independent and affiliated stations, the University of Chicago Roundtable. We present Louis Wirth of the Department of Sociology of the University of Chicago. Mr. Wirth.
In the United States, we have just had a political campaign in which civil rights and race relations were major campaign issues. Just about a year ago, we had the notable report of the President's Commission on Civil Rights entitled To Secure These Rights, which set a standard for this country to repair to. All over the world, the relations between the white Europeans and the colored peoples are burning issues. Hysterical people are interpreting this unrest as the beginning of a race war. What is the changing position of the white man in the United States, in Asia, in Africa, and elsewhere? Joining me in today's discussion at the University of Chicago Roundtable on race relations around the world are I. Shapira, Professor of Social Anthropology, University of Cape Town, South Africa, and at the present time visiting Professor of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. Michael Lowe, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Political Science, University of Pretoria, South Africa, and Phillips Talbot of the Department of Political Science. Talbot, how do you see the relations of the white man and the native peoples of the great continent of Asia?
Well, the white man doesn't even recognize himself today compared with where he stood 10 years ago. I don't suppose there's been greater changes anywhere in the world than in Southern Asia and the tropical Far East, where India and Pakistan and Ceylon and Burma have already got self-government, and where in Indochina and in Indonesia, and also to some extent in Malaya, there is a struggle among the people of the countries to upset the old order, and an equally vigorous struggle among the white men who are trying to stay on in the old pattern.
Shapira, how does it look in the rest of the world as you see it as an anthropologist?
Well, the situation in Asia is certainly changing, but I think Talbot might have referred to one or two areas near enough even to his Asia where things are not quite as much on the move. In Australia, for instance, there is really no race problem, but that is because the Australians have deliberately kept out anybody but non-Europeans. In New Zealand, again, the situation seems to be fairly harmonious because the New Zealanders have accorded to their Maori full rights and have assimilated them into their own civilization. And I think if we come nearer America, in Latin America, as far as we know, the three big groups in the population, Indians, imported Negroes, and Europeans, seem also to be living in harmony.
And Lowe, how does it look on the great continent of Africa?
That great continent is the last post of empire in the modern world. In the post-medieval period, when a vigorous, aggressive West spilled over into the New World with its twin extremes of materialist exploitation and democratic humanism, the pattern was set. And to a large extent, Africa today is still backward in terms of Western principles because those peoples are further away from these Western principles.
Well, in the discussion of the Human Rights Commission that are now going on in Paris, this issue that you have just mentioned is coming up every day. And there are some acrimonious debates taking place. And one of the things that strikes us is that on the one hand stand we with our democratic ideals and our unfinished business of democracy at home in solving our own race relations problems. And on the other hand, there are the Russians, who claim to have solved this problem in their own country, and who seem to be able to pose, at any rate, as champions of the oppressed everywhere. And one of the leading opponents in some of the discussions in the Civil Rights Commission, in the Human Rights Commission at the UN, recently have been the South Africans. How do you explain that, particularly in the light of the coming into power of the new government in South Africa, Shapira?
Well, Worth, the situation was bad enough under the old government. Under the new government, I think it's going to be even worse. I suppose I'd better tell you a little bit about the situation. Previously, before the new government, in South Africa, the Europeans were the ruling class. All members of parliament were Europeans, and it was only Europeans who had the universal adult franchise. Natives had a very limited vote, and they had to vote for European members of parliament, and were on a separate roll. The colored people were on the common roll, but had, again, discriminatory franchise rights. In addition, we have a color bar which debars entry into skilled professions of all non-European peoples, with the exception of the colored. And there is also residential segregation. That was the position. Today the position is worse. The present government has announced its policy of abolishing the native parliamentary representation. Parliamentary representation for Indians had been promised. The present government is dropping that. The present government proposes also to remove the colored people from the common roll. In addition, it is enforcing new and more rigid segregation policies.
And how can we explain these facts, Lowe? Is it just a matter of caprice? Or is this just a Nazi group coming in? Or what is it?
No, on the contrary, I think we can only explain this in terms of historical development. Here in South Africa, we have a resident white population which is in the minority, in the ratio of about 1 to 3. Elsewhere in the world, either the whites are a temporary group within a country and they have a mother country to which they can withdraw, or as in the United States, where the whites outnumber the blacks, they are in the complete majority and can be generous. In South Africa, it's entirely different.
Well, that looks to me as if it's a question of the South African whites maintaining their position partly by force. Of course, we know that in politics it isn't force alone or it isn't numbers alone. As long as the whites are very much more advanced in industry and commerce and economics and social life, they can maintain their domination without open force. The thing that strikes one is that as the other groups, the non-white groups, tend to develop, particularly developing middle-class leaders, then there comes a question which may bring force. Now, the thing I don't know about South Africa is to what extent the natives and the colored peoples are becoming self-conscious in that way.
They certainly are, mainly on account of the fact that there are certain integrative political philosophies today developing among them. The two extremes being the liberal democratic doctrines of the West, and on the other extreme, the possibility to which the South African government is particularly conscious of communism.
And is there any sign of communism in South Africa, Lowe?
It is certainly on the grow.
I think you underestimate the power of communism in South Africa. It's true that until last year, communism was relatively unimportant. So unimportant, in fact, that even the present government, with its notoriously anti-communist attitude, had to dismiss a case of sedition against the communist leaders. They could not find evidence. But on the other hand, just a few weeks ago, there was an election by the natives for their 3 parliamentary representatives. And one of the candidates in the Cape was a very well-known liberal, 40 years of unblemished reputation as a champion of native rights. Opposing him, a communist leader. The communist leader came in with a sweeping majority of over 3,000 votes, showing that communism is on the grow.
It appears then that we should find some other philosophy to integrate the natives in their rise.
Such as what?
The democratic process, which probably is very slow, and we should take the long-range view.
But do we have a favorable set of circumstances for that in South Africa? You've just said, you two South Africans, that what you have here is a small group of whites hopelessly outnumbered by the colored peoples and the native population, and that therefore you must go backward, whereas the rest of the world must go forward, or might go forward.
I don't think, Worth, that you must look at it quite in that way. You've got to realize that at least in South Africa, we are a minority. And the white people of South Africa, whether you like it or not, are determined as a minority to remain in control.
That means then that we're going to have no means but extremes in South Africa.
Oh, I disagree with that. You should take the long-range view, and that is that since the beginning of the 20th century, there has been a great increase in participation and in emancipation of the native races in South Africa. Today they are participating much more in both the economic and, to a certain extent, even in the political life of South Africa.
That is, though, a reluctant participation on the part of the Europeans, isn't it? Is it not true that one of the underlying philosophies of the present government party is to have some sort of partition, something, say, as you have in Palestine, where they have found it necessary, to split the states between Jews and Arabs, or as you have had in India?
No. Which all responsible opinion in South Africa, as we all know, definitely denies. Segregation is completely out of the question. It's impossible. The areas to which these groups can be segregated are too small, and you come up against most formidable economic problems.
Of course, both of you seem to be proceeding on the assumption, as good South Africans, I assume, that the white man can't give up his vested interest in South Africa, that he's got to hold on to them. And it seems to me that is just one of the questions that we ought to bring into the picture here.
It's not a question of vested interest, Will. It's a question of the white being the leader, the instructor, the master. It may be possible that the student may someday surpass the master, but in the present moment, everywhere in the world, not only South Africa, there is the position that the European has to be the teacher.
Well, then tell us what you expect in South Africa.
A gradual development of the principles of democracy and a gradual extension in a political and in a pragmatic sense of participation of the blacks in South Africa.
But you're going backwards now. You're disenfranchising those that even had a chance to be enfranchised, aren't you?
That is an entirely temporary setback.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because the coming into power of the Malone government came as a shock to all the people that I know in the field of race relations throughout the world. They had assumed that the defeat of the Nazis meant the end of racist nationalism as a political force. And now you're telling me it's just a transitory phenomenon. Is that correct?
I disagree with Lowe. It is not merely the present government which stands for this policy, but the great majority of the white people in South Africa, even the opposition party, General Smuts' party, would have many supporters, give many supporters to the present government's policy of repression.
In their moments of fear, but not in their moments of magnanimity.
In magnanimity, they will provide education and lower the color bars, will they, gradually, and open the trade unions and open the franchise?
Very definitely so. We are members of Western civilization and essentially humanists.
Well, Shapiro, tell us more about your point of view.
My point of view is very, very simple. I'm speaking now as a South African, trying to justify the attitude of most South Africans, not my own attitude. My own attitude is to extend equal rights to all civilized men. The attitude of the great majority of South Africans is to keep whatever privileges they have at the present moment, and hoping to keep that for their children to come as well. I think Lowe is far too optimistic.
I think we pardon that fundamental disagreement.
Well, before you go back to South Africa, of course, I should like to say to you that we, too, have our Dixiecrats in the United States and our people who believe in white supremacy. But fortunately, in the last election, they were hopelessly outvoted, and that we're not going to adopt their policy. But I think it is a fact, as you have mentioned, that South Africa represents one of the crucial cases as we go around the world and look at the race relationship that exists. Some time ago, H.G. Wells, in one of his interesting books called The Outlook for Homo Sapiens, said that slowly but surely a racial self-consciousness, a collective resentment is being forced upon the Negro, not only in South Africa, but throughout the world. And South Africa seems the inevitable theater for its release. I hope you can make that release orderly and progressive, Shapiro and Lowe, as you go back. Now, Talbot, as we look at the question of race relations around the world, and we assume that South Africa is something of an exceptional case, as our colleagues have just told us, does this mean that the end of white domination is near?
It certainly means the end of the white domination that we knew 15 years ago. What's happened in Asia since the Japanese started out in 1931 and 1937 in China, and finally after Pearl Harbor, has been, I think, a true revolution. The old order is breaking up. I would, before we discuss this thing in detail, point out a couple of things. One is that as the white position changes, there is no unified colored front against the whites. And second, although the old position of the whites is gone, there may very well be a new position in which we can continue to play a role of honor and influence.
What will be the basis of understanding, Talbot?
Well,
the common basis on which both the East and the West can agree.
There are different ways in which this problem is being handled, of course. I don't think that it's entirely a question of morals. In fact, I don't know any place where national policy has been decided entirely on as a matter of morals. But when we get a changed power position and have to revise our opinions and situations, then there are different ways of handling the problem. And I point to the relatively graceful withdrawal of the British from India, which I thought was done
for the Europeans to keep withdrawing gracefully everywhere.
I'm suggesting that the British in India, having withdrawn gracefully, are in a stronger position there today.
Well, might I not add, Talbot, that we in the...
And I point to the relatively graceful withdrawal of the British from India. Thought was done very successfully, and which indeed increased British prestige because of the way it was handled.
Are you suggesting by any chance, Talbot, that the solution would be for the Europeans to keep withdrawing gracefully everywhere?
I'm suggesting that the British in India, having withdrawn gracefully, are in a stronger position there today.
Well, might I not add, Talbot, that we in the United States, too, have certainly set an example in that respect. We not only have withdrawn gracefully, but in time and with great dignity from the Philippines. and we're about to consider the opening of Hawaii, territory, and of Alaska, and of Puerto Rico as candidates for statehood in the United States of America. That surely would be an example to the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's what an American, of course, would definitely say. But withdrawal itself is no simple solution. Withdrawal implies a total denial of the further and continued responsibility of the white man as teacher, if he is a good teacher. I can only point to Liberia, where I don't think the American experiment is very successful.
And, of course, Loeb might have added, too, that withdrawal is not always possible. We have, after all, again, to come back to South Africa, where you have a permanently settled European population, which certainly will not withdraw. What is the solution to be there?
Well, as we look at it, Shapira, around the world, the white man is being outnumbered about 3-1 by the colored native peoples of the world. And it may be that if we do not work out a feasible system, the same hysteria that has gripped South Africa may grip some other country.
Well, I do feel this, that there are situations, power situations, where withdrawal is the better part of valor, particularly when one looks at Indonesia, where the Dutch are struggling and have struggled since the war to try to retrieve a position for which they no longer have the power. And similarly in Indochina, the French there are to some extent exhausting themselves in this same, what seems to me, fruitless quest, and at the same time ruining their own prestige.
But Talbot, you must bear in mind that in Indonesia and in the whole of Asia, you had a culture, or you had a social organization much closer, much more approximate to the Western system than on the African continent.
That, of course, is a very valid point. Throughout the whole of Africa, the great majority of the indigenous peoples are still very, very backward. And we cannot possibly, at the present moment, leave them. Britain, for instance, is doing its best in West Africa. But it'll be many years yet, I think, before Britain will walk out of West Africa. In the meantime, she is educating the people to govern themselves more properly one day than they are doing at present.
I would agree that certainly is not a thing, as I said, a question of morals, where all whites should move out immediately. But we in the United States feel, some of us, that we're losing prestige among the more advanced peoples, say, of Indonesia and Indochina, because we are supporting powers which have passed their prime within the area, Holland and France. There are very good reasons, of course. We're primarily interested in Western Europe, and we feel we must maintain the stability of Holland and France. But what I would argue is that for our future, our long-range future, we must also recognize that things do change, and that we must keep in touch with the new forces in Southeast Asia.
But you certainly subscribe to a very negative policy. Shouldn't there be a more positive element in our policy, namely to support exactly those forces which come closer to our democratic ideals?
But, Lo, what Talbot has been pointing out, as I see it, is a point of view that I share very much. That in many of these cases, where it came to resolving the conflict between the dominant white groups in the Far East, in Malay, in South Asia, in Africa, we have generally sided with the wrong people. We have supported the status quo, which meant the continued exploitation of the native peoples and the denial of them of those rights that we presumably stand for in the United Nations. And so we have lowered our prestige as over against this other great competitive power of ours, the Soviet Union, which has been able, perhaps irresponsibly, to stand on the side of the peoples who are clamoring for power and who are the oppressed.
Let's face the situation here. Originally, we in America started out as a revolutionary country. Today, Russia claims to be a revolutionary country. The communists in every one of these Southeast Asian countries have aligned themselves with the nationalist movement. But I have a feeling, and when I was in Indonesia last year, when I was in Indochina, people there told me that the feeling had some justification, that there is a difference between nationalism and communism, even now, and that when the nationalist campaigns in Southeast Asia are won, if they are won, a situation would arise just as it has in India, where the national government is probably one of the strongest opponents of communism anywhere in Asia.
In other words, nationalism is taking the place of this native suppression, but it is not going in the direction of communism, because these people now have responsibility for their own government.
So, is it wrong then to support the nationalists as against the communists in the Asiatic pattern? Talbot?
I don't think that we can separate them so long as there is the conflict with the West.
Well, looking at this problem as an anthropologist, Shapira, what do you see as the proper role of the West in these changes that are going on all over the world that involve the native peoples that are just coming to consciousness?
Well, I should think, first of all, in very, very long-range terms, the white man has to get rid of the idea that he is necessary for the welfare of the world. At present, he is. It doesn't mean that in the long run he has to remain over there. But while he is there, while he is necessary, it is first and foremost his duty to start educating those people up to the level when they can face conditions of modern life.
And that means creating a middle class and intellectuals and native leaders, does it not?
It means creating native leaders. Whether it can dispense with the middle class, I don't know.
We have a very good lesson in history where the French lower classes were not up to the standard of the aristocracy. They couldn't take government, and that started the sad history of the post-revolutionary period in France.
I don't entirely agree with the theory of the white man's burden, but I do think that the white man certainly will have a great role to play. Obviously, in this stage in history, the Western nations are far more advanced technologically and in a good many other ways than the nations which are just emerging, really, into any sort of self-control. I think that there is a real contribution that we in the West can make, and I think it's an important enough contribution so that we can compete with the communists if we do it properly.
Not only technologically, Talbot, I think, but we should also bear in mind that the United Nations Charter is essentially an instrument of Western conception. The whole idea of the emancipation of the individual is essentially a Western conception. And in that regard, the continued reorientation of these concepts should be done either by the West or by those of the non-West who have ascribed or subscribed to the...
That brings me back to the point that's been worrying me all along. We've been talking here about the West and what it must do for the dependent peoples. But isn't there also a further task of education? If these United Nations principles are ever to be put into force, doesn't the West have to educate the West? Don't we in South Africa need a good deal more of enlightened education ourselves? And for that matter, don't you in America need much more?
Yes, you are saying, Shapiro, that this education has to begin with ourselves, with the white man, with the civilized Europeans and Americans.
It is an entirely new set of circumstances which we have to face.
I'd like to point out one other thing, which is that although we've been talking about the white man and the other races of the world, actually that's just one phase of this whole problem. In Southeast Asia, for example, the Malaysian residents are just as much worried about the Chinese merchant class as they are about the white, though at a different level. In Burma, there's quite some concern about the Indians, who have taken a large part of the control of the economy and who are now being pushed out. Besides, it isn't a question of one race against another so much as it is economic domination, social and cultural differences, things of that sort, which are far broader.
I agree with you in that, but still, we in the West do think of these terms primarily in terms of race. It is the white man looking against the rest.
But isn't the color there merely a kind of a visible symbol that hides all the things that Talbot talked about, namely economic differences, difference in education, difference in religion, difference in culture? And if it weren't for these other conflicts, the problem of color would not really become very serious.
Only because the color today coincides with economic division.
But as Talbot has pointed out, Lowe, I think we ought to realize that it is possible to carry on some cooperation with these peoples on the road to advancement. They're anxious for our economic aid as they are for our educational aid, but they don't want that to be coupled with political and social domination. Would you agree to that?
Oh, certainly. Financial imperialism is the word that's often used in the Southeast Asia, even about Americans, or particularly about Americans. They don't want aid on those terms, but they do turn to us if we can give them the sort of aid that is of use to them.
Well, now, if we are to turn to the programs that are now underway for solving these very complicated and worldwide problems, one of the great areas of hope we have is in the United Nations. Would you agree? And
yes.
There are two problems that confront the people who are drafting the Covenant on Human Rights. One is to establish what these rights shall be, and second, to find out what means can be used to guarantee these rights. As you look at it now, gentlemen, if you look at the situation as it now stands, it looks pretty hopeless because there is endless quarreling, such as the one that I've mentioned about the South Africans objecting to equal rights for all. But there is still great progress that we can note, is there not? As between World War I and the treatment of minorities then and the end of World War II and the treatment of minorities now.
Certainly people are saying things nowadays and subscribing to principles nowadays which 20 years ago would have horrified them. To that extent, yes, there is hope.
Again, I would say that it's a question of coupling the morality of the situation with the changes in power factors involved, and that the second consideration is of extreme importance, particularly in Southeast Asia.
And that, I think, is a very useful distinction. that the one is a matter of principle and the other one is a matter of pragmatic politics.
Well, in the case of end of World War I, we merely said we guarantee the rights of minorities, and we were never able to enforce it.
That's right.
Today, we say we guarantee the rights of everyone, and that we ought to be able to enforce not only through the UN, but through the constituent states that make it up. Now, one of the ways that we have found for leading the native peoples and the so-called backward peoples to equality of opportunity is through the trusteeship system. Is that not another hope for the peaceful solution of these problems, Talbot?
Oh, it certainly is another hope, and I think everyone would support it and go along with it, hoping that it would be effective.
But again, one can't help feeling skeptical about a good deal of trusteeship even. Is the trustee ever going to hand over to his ward? That, I feel, is a problem which is not one that one can be hopeful about.
I think that we have to remember and repeat that there are people in this world who see the future problem as a race, as a fight between the whites and the colors. They're hysterical. They feel the rising tide of color is going to overwhelm the more advanced parts of the world. We do have the Malaysians who fear the Chinese. We do have the differences between the hill people and the plains people of Burma. We have very many other things which are factors and which are very important, showing that the problem is much wider than this.
It is not now, Talbot, and it need not be a global racial war that is going to split our civilization apart and the peoples of the world apart. And we in America, of course, can set a good example to the rest of the world by remedying some of our own shortcomings at home, so that we can face more courageously and with greater integrity the responsibility that confronts us in the United Nations and throughout the world. We have every sign that we in this country are marching forward. We realize the problems that you people have in South Africa and that some other colonial powers have throughout the world. But these problems, too, can be solved if, first of all, we assume that all human beings are entitled to certain inalienable equal rights of opportunity, and if they're entitled to the protection of their respective governments throughout the world.
Thank you, gentlemen. You've been listening to the University of Chicago Roundtable discuss race relations around the world with Isaac Shapira, Professor of Social Anthropology, University of Cape Town, South Africa, and at the present time, Visiting Professor of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. Michael Lowell, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Political Science, University of Pretoria, South Africa, and Philip Talbot of the Department of Political Science, and Louis Wirth of the Department of Sociology, both of the University of Chicago, as participants. This week's Roundtable pamphlet includes the full text of today's discussion, a special article on, quote, Race Relations and World Peace, unquote, by Professor Robert Redfield. You'll want to receive this pamphlet and to read these important supplementary materials on problems of race relations. Be sure to write for your copy and send 10 cents in coin with your order to the University of Chicago Roundtable, Chicago 37, Illinois. For $3, you may subscribe to the pamphlet for a full year and receive 52 weekly issues. I repeat the address, the University of Chicago Roundtable, Chicago 37, Illinois. Next week, the Roundtable will discuss the election and the Republican Party. The National Broadcasting Company, its independent affiliated stations, have cooperated in the presentation of this discussion, which brings to the American listener various shades of opinion on important public issues. This is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company.